If that's what you mean.
Go live.
Are we live?
Oh, it's all your learning events?
Yeah. Oh, I wasn't going to go to it. But then I was like,
Yeah, I'm the last person that works in the society. For now.
Oh. Wait, is this part of
It's from the union. Yeah, so they're committee.
Oh, this is the thing that you're working on.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, so.
it's just like
It's like our committee and then the director. Huh? Oh shoot. Why is that picking me up? Why is that mine? Well, that's bad. Oh wow. Let's just explain.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Micah, I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Associate Director of Programming at the Wisconsin Union Directorate, Society and Politics Committee. I'm pleased to welcome you all to our guest lecture event, Understanding the Crisis in Afghanistan. Thank you for joining us tonight, both in person here at Memorial Union and virtually via live stream. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejo since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today, and please join in uncovering such truths every day. Thank you. The Wisconsin Union Directorate Society and Politics Committee, or SoPo, is an organization on campus dedicated to fostering respectful discourse on social and political issues among students. This year, our committee is working eagerly to establish engaging and educational programming through non-traditional means. We aim to amplify student voices, especially those in marginalized communities, by empowering them to create conversations that are often not openly discussed on campus. Tonight, UW-Madison Professor Jon Pevehouse will present remarks on the subject of Afghanistan. His lecture will seek to clarify the current state of the nation, appropriately summarize the events of the past 8 to 10 months, and describe how US-Afghan relations will be affected in the future based on these actions. Jon Pevehouse is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor in Political Science and Public Policy. His research interests are in the field of international relations and political methodology. He has received several teaching awards, including the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award. He is the recipient of the Carl Letcher Award, an international award given to a scholar under age 40 who has made the most significant contribution to the study of international relations. He has also served as the editor of the leading professional journal in the field, International Organization. We are very excited to have him here with us tonight at this time. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Jon Pevehouse.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming out. I know it's a really busy time in the semester for those of you who are students, and I appreciate you taking the time to come and hear me give some thoughts on the state of Afghanistan, what's happened in Afghanistan, and at least maybe a prediction or two about what might likely happen in the coming months, years in Afghanistan. So basically what I would like to do in today's talk is to reflect a little bit on why Afghanistan, why the US got involved in Afghanistan, what happened there. Was this, as I've called elsewhere, kind of a necessary failure from American foreign policy point of view? And as Micah so adequately introduced my speech by saying, what now? What happens after this past August and the Taliban's emergence in control of the country, the United States withdrawal from that country. And so I want to kind of go through two main sets of thoughts. The first is the idea that the U.S. was attempting to build kind of a stable, maybe democratic, maybe pseudo-democratic state in Afghanistan, and why that was going to be very difficult. And some of the factors that made that incredibly difficult, based on what we know after about 80 years of research in political science on the conditions under which we think democracies are likely to emerge or not emerge. And it's relevant not just as a sort of look back on what happened and the challenges that did confront Afghanistan and efforts to build new institutions in Afghanistan, but also moving forward the challenges that confront Afghanistan. That's sort of one set of thoughts. The other set will be about sort of the implications of the fall of Kabul in August of 2021. Was the government in Kabul, the rise of the Taliban, that means basic human rights, geopolitics in the region. So, again, as most people know, the United States became involved in Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks on the United States. We quickly trained our sights on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban protectors in Afghanistan. One thing I would note, just in terms of the timeline, so the attacks on September 11th were followed a few days later by an authorization of Congress to essentially open and authorize military force on who was responsible for these attacks. So 9/11 to October 7th, 2001 were the first U.S. airstrikes in Afghanistan. By the 19th was the first commitment of ground forces by the United States. By November 9th, right, a month and 2 days after initial airstrikes, the kind of key strategic town of Mazar-e-Sharif had fallen. The Taliban was on the run. 3 days later, Kabul fell. Right, so about a month from initial U.S. action to the fall of the government. This tracks almost identically to the reemergence of the Taliban and their significant opening of an offensive front this past summer in the fall of Kabul. Right, things tend to happen very quickly in Afghanistan, at least. Sort of once you get a tipping point and once things start to really go, things like regime changes happen very quickly in that country. And I think there's a reason why, which is that Afghanistan has no real significant history of sort of stable political institutions, often because they are being forced on them or they are being pushed one way or another by outside powers. So, but from that time, right, from the initial fall, from the initial installation of interim government in Afghanistan on November 22nd, 2001, really until 2021, right, for that 20-year period, roughly speaking, you went through a transitional regime, writing a new constitution, new elections, etc. And there was a lot of factors that led to there being problems with this new constitution and these new factors. Part of it is just the history of Afghanistan. Right, which is one of significant suffering and tragedy, human tragedy. It's largely been uninstitutionalized, or it's been institutionalized, one would say, as a buffer state in a great power game, initially between Russia and the British, as Ray Kipling referred to it, the Great Game, and it has not changed much since in terms of being sort of more of a locus of great power interest rather than investment, long-run investment. So again, I want to reflect on, is Afghanistan likely to have successful institutions and then the implications for withdrawal. So, a couple of years ago, political scientist at Princeton named James Breland wrote a paper where he highlighted that there have been at least 35 different factors noted by political scientists and scholars of foreign policy or comparative government, 35 factors that have been linked to individual cases or group cases of democratization, successfully creating governments, changing governments, and creating kind of representative institutions that respect human purpose. That's a lot. It's a lot of different variables. It's a lot of different factors. So I want to highlight what he concluded were some of the main ones that historically been important across a number of different cases. I'm going to divide them into two groups. One's internal, one's external. Internally, it seems a little bit cynical, but the data is very clear that a key factor to democracy is income. Until 2006, in the Thai military coup, there had never been a failure of a democracy in a country with a per capita GDP over $35 million per capita. And so there's clearly some correlation. Now, the question is why? Why does wealth matter for whether states are democratic or not? It should, because of course we can all point to many countries that are wealthy and not democratic. And even some countries that are sort of right at this relatively low level of per capita income, and then are democratic, such as Bangladesh. If we're focusing on transitions too, it really seems to be about the distribution of the income, not the overall level. Political scientist Martin Lipset once argued that really it's about a healthy middle class. There's some evidence for that. But the bottom line is that in the Afghan case, it's interesting to reflect on this. The income distribution in Afghanistan, the rich-poor gap, the Gini coefficient wealth income gap, however you want to define it, is actually not that different than many other countries in the world. But the important question is then how was, for example, aid distributed? How, once there was a new institution, once there was a new government in power post-2001, how did they handle distributional issues, taxation issues, etc.? I want to circle back to that, but the short answer is not particularly well. They tended to concentrate wealth into a few hands, especially through foreign aid, mostly to try to buy loyalty to the new government, and that is never a recipe for long-run success for a popular government, especially in a multi-ethnic society. So income is certainly one issue. Related to that, a second factor, people pointed out, both as a negative and a positive, are natural resources. The current scholarship is sort of a Goldilocks approach. Too many natural resources. You don't want to be an oil state, very few democracies. Highly functional governments that have a lot of oil that are representative. But you also you don't want nothing either. You want sort of be just right in between. Unfortunately, Afghanistan is hampered by the lack of easily mobilized economic resources. There was significant progress after 2001. The new government in 2001 undertook a large set of agricultural modernization reforms. Lots of wealthy expats who had left when the Taliban came to power reinvested in Afghanistan. They came back, they brought their money back, and began to sort of invest in local production capabilities, whether on the manufacturing side or on the agricultural side. But given the overall degradation of the education system that had happened under the Taliban, inclusion of learning from education, for example, and 2 decades of civil war prior, right, which we'll talk about again in a second, right, Afghanistan was not exactly, for the last 30 years, an example of peace and stability. There's lots of conflict going on there. All these factors lead to a lack of human capital in the short term for Afghanistan. And there was progress made. But there weren't exactly piles of natural resources lying around to be exploited for quick economic growth. The economy became very much dependent on aid as a result, or these outside funds as a result. Again, what political science research suggests is not exactly a clear success or a recipe for success for democratization, for new human rights and representative institutions. Third, and again, not a surprise to anyone, ethnic divisions. Right? Afghanistan is a highly multi-ethnic society. It's plurality Pashtun. There are large communities of Tajiks, Hazara, Uzbeks, Balaks, Turkmen. all of which make up at least 2% of the population or more. The more cleavages there are, the more ethnic cleavages in a particular country, the more difficult it is for political institutions to take root, representative political institutions, I should say, to take root. Part of the analysis of this, part of the explanation for this, lies in the emergence of party systems, political parties. And there are lots of examples of this throughout even the 20th century. When you build a new government in a country that's not had representative institutions, not had democracy, people form political parties. Well, how do you form political parties when no one's aware of each other's political identities? Right? This is new. You're in a democracy. You've never been allowed to say these things before. Well, the easy, simple way to do it is ethnicity. Right? You assume that people who look like you or speak like you probably have similar preferences to you. And this is how we find that new democracies often form their party systems based around that identity. These ethnic identities then work on sort of what we've labeled ethnic outbidding, which is essentially trying to claim power and nationalism in the country as being the true ethnic group, which leads to lots of conflicts, initially through elections and election outbidding, but often then eventually through military violence or social violence on the other side. This has not always been the case. Former UW-Madison professor Mark Weisinger has pointed out that, for example, the Soviet republics, this wasn't particularly common, but in many cases, it is. Now, what from a political science perspective is fascinating about watching Afghanistan over the last 2 decades has been that they realized this. Right? There were lots of, believe it or not, political science professors, international consultants, who sort of were giving advice to the Afghan government about how they should structure the rules, how they should structure politics. So political parties were something that were heavily discouraged in Afghanistan. It's very reason. Eventually they were allowed, but for example, in the initial parliamentary elections in Afghanistan, to the loyal shirka, these were single-member, non-transferable votes in multi-member districts. In other words, you did not need to be a member of a party, right? You could run as an individual. You were encouraged not to run represented by a political party, all because the fear that people would fall back on ethnic identity and just vote for, again, people who look and vote like them, which had been reinforced all these ethnic cleavages in the country and leads to potential failure of their political system. Now, eventually, because of large demands on the government, political parties are legalized and allowed to run, as in most democracies. Yet the bar to run as a political party in Afghanistan was very high. To form a party and be formally registered, you needed 10,000 signatures. Those 10,000 signatures had to be distributed across every single province in the country. In other words, you couldn't just take one ethnic group and form one small political party and run on that basis. Again, that seemed to be done correctly from a classic, political science point, comparative politics point of view. But still, even with these requirements and this high bar, a large number of political parties were formed. Many of these were formed by young people in the country, and young people demanded political parties in Afghanistan. Many of these political parties ended up providing social and economic services, even if they decided to not be active in particular elections. So in other words, people did eventually in many ways fall back on those habits of only wanting to interact with people of similar ethnicities because they felt safe, because they felt like that was the way in which they could properly organize their society moving forward. But again, and sometimes again, there are classic examples of democracies where this has worked, but far more where it is not, and it's led to conflict. Fourth, history of institutions, I mentioned this in passing already. The history of Afghanistan is one where there have not been a lot of long-run stable political institutions. If you look at cases where new governments, new democracies, new functional governments have formed out of wars, historically speaking, places like Japan, Germany, even Kosovo more recently, after the 1999 war there, previous to those wars, previous to those conflicts, they had a long run of highly functional stable institutions, even if they weren't democracies. People knew how to do things. There were occasionally local elections. There were bureaucratic institutions. Services were delivered in a reliable manner. But again, the Afghan history is unfortunately littered with fairly failed regimes, partly because of ethnic divisions, partly because of the great game of colonization and external interference. After all, Afghanistan's modern borders were created by Britain to serve as protection, as a buffer against the Russians to the British Empire in South Asia. So, in other words, no one had Afghani's interest in as policies, let alone the Soviet invasion in 1979 and the previous Soviet interference 2 years prior. We often refer to the Taliban as this sort of long-running, long-standing regime in Afghanistan. It had only been in power since 1996. It was there 5 years. That's it. That's how long it had lasted. We, again, sort of, I think his hindsight, and his hindsight bias of saying they were around a long time. They weren't. And the government before them had not been around a long time either. And so we had this sort of rapid set of turmoils. Now again, this was all known to the people post-2001 designing the Constitution, thinking through how the system would work. So again, take the 2004 Constitution. They centralized a lot of power in the executive, right? In the sort of equivalence of president. Whether it was under Karzai or Ashraf Ghani after Karzai. And it points to a really difficult problem in transitional countries. Given the challenges of governing, you need a strong central authority. Right? You need someone to enforce rules. But it's that strong central authority that also brings corruption. We'll talk about it in a minute. And it concerns minority groups, concerns with minority rights, liberties, etc. Part of the solution is going to be the parliament, the jury, right, which would have representation across from a number of voices across the country, not just along ethnic lines, but along gender lines, as well as socioeconomic lines. For example, female representation along jury was incredibly high and widespread. Unfortunately, though, the jury was not given much power. Ultimately, they were only able to force the presidents of Afghanistan to do so much when it came to political reform, when it came to the distribution of resources, and so all of the representation, however, didn't add up to serve a wide, long goal of political stabilization. And of course, it was not saying some governments in institutions. The Taliban was always there. Right? Opposition from different ethnic groups were always there. And that leads to the next cause of what led to significant issues, which was political violence. Right? There was always an insurgency going on, even under the transitional government, under the new government, after elections, there was violence. Taliban violence, ethnic violence. I think many Americans who had not served in Afghanistan, did not serve in Afghanistan, their family that did, kind of underappreciated the continued violence that took place in that country. I mean, never forget, we continued to increase the number of forces in Afghanistan until 2010. We sent more and more forces there. Why was this, in my opinion, the coverage on Afghanistan was light. Right? We were kind of unaware of a lot of the crises that were happening. I wouldn't say on a weekly basis, but certainly on a monthly basis on the military side of that country. Why? Iraq. Iraq grabbed the headlines as of 2003. That's what everyone talked about. And that's what everyone talked about. And that's what everyone considered the main foreign policy crises from 2003 forward. But all of this time, Afghanistan continues to have issues. Afghanistan continues to be a problem when it comes to violence and political stability. On the violent side. Yes, there was guerrilla violence, but well into 2002 and 2003, there were high-profile battles that engaged thousands of troops on both sides, between the Afghan government, the Taliban, in one case Al-Qaeda, marshaled well over 1,000 forces to invade the town controlled by the interim government. And there was still a heavy war going on, even though in the U.S. press this was largely pitched as, well, we won, this was fast, we're done, Al-Qaeda out. But that was not the case on the ground. As they served their battalion, or sort of deeper look at the headlines review. Final internal factor I briefly mentioned before was, saying corruption. Even by 2020, Afghanistan was rated the 12th most corrupt country in the world. We have income inequality, relative income inequality, corruption, they're dependent on foreign aid. This does not bode well for governance. It does not bode well for democracy, equality, human rights, and everything that comes with it. Look at the internal factors, right? And all those factors are still present. Right? Many of those factors are still there when we think about the future of Afghanistan, which I'll come back to in the next section. Let me quickly mention external factors though. It's not just things going on in the country that matter for whether it stabilizes after a war. There are external factors as well. First and most important, what's your neighborhood like? Do Do you live in a good neighborhood? Do you live in a threatening neighborhood? The US and the UK are classic examples. Our democracies evolved over hundreds of years as island states. The UK largely, although not always, independent from the military conflicts or could choose to enter or not enter military conflicts, same with the United States. But Afghanistan is surrounded by countries who do not have its best interests at heart at all times. Indeed, this is always a threat to democracy. Whether it's Pakistan, or Iran, or Russia, or even its border with China, there's always a potential for instability if, of course, Pakistan tops that list. The Taliban had a place to hide. The Taliban had a place to go. When Kabul fell in 2001, it didn't fall in the middle of the day in a big battle. It fell in the middle of the night, and all the Taliban left and ran into the hills and the mountains, into Tora, into Waziristan, into the Pakistani border regions, and that's where they stayed, somewhat protected by Pakistan itself. And so when the time comes, when the U.S. got tired, the U.S. was ready to leave, or showed signs of being ready to leave, they were ready. They had been protected, they had been rearmed, they had been retrained, and they were ready to re-enter the scene. As I'll come back to those, interestingly enough, those factors still matter today. Another factor, some of my own work has highlighted international and regional organizations that affect on democratization, whether it's the European Union, Organization of American States, even Southern African Development Community organizations, that played a role in particular cases in cementing and solidifying democracy. None of those types of international organizations exist in that part of the world, so regional organizations. Another factor, the last two factors discussed here, one is aid, foreign aid. So Afghanistan had a lot of aid, you've probably read. For example, compare the amount of money spent in Afghanistan during the American time there versus the Marshall Plan. Pales in comparison. Marshall Plan pales in comparison. Now, of course, overall, we know that the U.S. gave approximately $40 billion in non-military aid to Afghanistan. Now, it's tricky because overall, the Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, the U.S. official, estimates that about $150 billion in U.S. aid is given, qualified as non-military aid, but much of that was security aid. And it did accomplish a lot. For example, the number of students in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2020 went from 900,000 to 9.5 million. There were 20,000 new elementary schools built in a 20-year period. Higher education enrollment went from 7,000 to 200,000. The share of females in schools, primary schools in Afghanistan, went from 5,000 in number to 39% in 2020. Life expectancy increased dramatically, up to 65 years. Thousands of miles of paved road were added. The GDP of Afghanistan went from $4 billion in 2001 to $20 billion in 2020. Right? But of course, all of that, as I mentioned, is not on the backs of oil and resources, it was on the back of aid. And how do we know whether aid works or not? Well, a lot of it's about how it's distributed. Is it distributed by international organizations? Is it distributed by donor countries? Is it distributed by the home country itself? And most of the aid in Afghanistan is distributed by all three of these ways, but some of the key sources of aid became distributed by the central government, which, as I mentioned, took a very strong hold over the distribution of this aid, tried to distribute it equally, but eventually basically were mostly trying to bribe groups into staying loyal to the government, rather than sort of a broad societal practice of distributing aid. So, final external factor. I think it would be remiss not to point out that there was, in my opinion, a disjuncture between the military strategy of the United States, what we viewed as sort of the military side of this operation in 2001, versus the institutional building strategy and nation building. Because one of the key questions I think we have to think about, historically, this whole episode, is the following. So let's take for a minute something that, and I will assert this, that post 9/11, after 9/11, the United States involved in Afghanistan was in some type of military operation. It was going to happen in Afghanistan post 9/11. Then what decisions have to be made? Well, what do we know? We know that there was a deep, deep debate within the Bush White House in 2001 about what then after the invasion. It could have Colin Powell, versus Afghanistan. Powell's observation was that we should go in, using the Powell doctrine, what he was famous for knowing, right? Go in with a significant force, try to control the operation, try to control the humanitarian situation, and if you really do want to build institutions and don't want to just leave the country and have the Taliban immediately come back to power, have a sizable military force there to undertake the operation to nation building. Rumsfeld, who won the debate, had the opposite strategy: lean, mean, in, out. And unfortunately, Rumsfeld won. And so we were left initially with a transitional government trying clinging to power with U.S. help, with U.S. aid, but very little U.S. military aid and assistance. Which is why, if you look at, again, the distribution, I should say, the deployment of U.S. troops in Afghanistan over time, it starts small and it eventually takes a decade to rise. The great counterfactual would be, had the U.S. gone in with a much more significant military force in the short term, the history would turn out different. Hard to know. There certainly would have been other advantage costs and disadvantages to a different strategy, for sure. And that's not to say it would have turned out potentially not even worse. But I will say, I think that is an important counterfactual that we should consider about the kind of misalignment between the military and the political strategy that came to be adopted in that country. All right, moving forward. That's kind of the past. And again, a lot of those factors were, not A, but those factors about the neighborhood, corruption, institutions, history, ethnicity are all still there. So what does Afghanistan look like moving forward? I wish I could give you good news. In the short run, Afghanistan is going to be a humanitarian and a political disaster. I think it already is. Economically, the aid spigot has largely been turned off. Right? There's very little aid going into Afghanistan. The aid that remains largely comes from countries like Russia and China. I'll get back to them, but they're the key players now in this region. The banking sector has essentially shut down. It's almost impossible to get money in or out after the Taliban take over. The new regime has placed extensive capital control so that the financial movement in and out of the country. There's been a run on our currency, and that happened even before the U.S. troops left the country. And so economically, we've got a country that no one really wants to do business with at this point. In part because of the violence that continues, because they don't trust the Taliban, because what few resources the Taliban has, they've essentially put on lockdown. Not necessarily irrationally, given the situation they're in, but it doesn't exactly make for the prospects for successful economic growth or anything but future economic hardship. Next issue. Afghanistan is in the middle of a third COVID wave. For the new Omicron variant, they're still dealing with the Delta, and there's been a massive increase in cases of COVID. The Taliban has stopped all trade at the border, including medical supplies. Supply of goods is severely constrained, although last week the Taliban did start to ease some of those constraints, which are medical issues. And again, I would point out, sometimes it's because the Taliban shuts it down, sometimes it's because typical suppliers who have been running in and out of Afghanistan don't want to go either because of violence, because they don't trust the Taliban, and so it's just a lack of security pressure. So there's a health crisis on top of an economic crisis, on top of a political crisis in the country. Again, little desire for international organizations to be deeply involved with the Taliban at this particular time. We will see if that changes. Politically, of course, the conflict continues. There's actually a call from the United States that we should actually sort of engage in the country by starting to fund or at least provide some assistance to some of the rebel groups that have now emerged to fight against the Taliban. I think these calls will probably not go anywhere interesting. The Islamic State, of course, became active in the last decade. That is the IS Khorasan in the country. They're not, let's say this, they're not sort of part of the Islamic State that we came to know in Syria and Iraq, but they claim allegiance to it. And they claim to adopt strategies and goals of creating an Islamic State in Afghanistan. About a month ago, there was a serious bombing in Kunduz of a Shiite mosque. There was also the airport bombing while the U.S. troops were attempting to leave. The Taliban dismisses the IS, sort of a globally terrorist group that they will easily get control of, but so far they've not, and they've not been able to. Both, of course, are Islamic groups that they have lost to one another. There are different views of the boundaries of what an Islamic State would be, as well as different interpretations of Sharia law. Many within the IS are from the Haqqani network, which used to be allied with the Taliban, although they have become estranged over time, as the Taliban is hiding out in Pakistan. Now, what's interesting is, for the most part, IS does not have safe havens in neighboring countries like the Taliban did. So now there's interesting debates over the Taliban can root out the IS. And you find people in Washington really deeply at odds over this, as to how the Taliban is going to deal with this sort of rise in the Islamic State in Afghanistan. Some believe that they're sort of easily able to do it, that they developed security networks while the U.S. was even still in Afghanistan. They can use those to get out, although many people on the other side point out that the IS so far has been able to easily evade those security networks that the Taliban has set up. From a human rights perspective, I think on this issue, the key group to watch are the Tsars. The Shiites, they're Shiites, the Tsars are Shiites, and as they're anti-Taliban and anti-IS. Initially, when the Taliban took over in 1996, they committed a number of atrocities against the Tsar communities. They've now pledged to protect the Tsar communities from the Islamic State. However, they've so far not done that, and this bombing is certainly not the sign of this. What does this mean in general for foreign policy? How do the politics play out? So, the bottom line for Afghanistan is, in the short run, until people begin to return the aid, until there's some sort of humanitarian effort with the Taliban, the economic, health, and political instability in that country will have an enormous cost on the population. And that is one of the true tragedies of the current situation. But of course, given the Taliban's past, given the violence that continues in the country, it's hard to imagine aid groups of any stripe charging in to do anything about the humanitarian crisis that looms in that country. We talked for a minute about sort of geopolitics and the foreign policy of the region. I think the fall of Kabul in August was clearly a black eye for the Biden administration. We can talk about whether that's fair, whether that's a fair assessment or not, but the narrative which has taken over clearly, at best for the Biden administration, is right decision, poor execution. Posing background earlier than they probably should, etc. There's lots of things we can talk about that I think were early decisions made for the Biden administration that made this more difficult. That said, the flip side argument goes, any withdrawal is going to be a problem, problematic. Right? In any type of civil war situation where you have an outside actor involved, any local combatant on either side should make a safe bet. And that safe bet is that the outside force is not going to stay very long. 20 years was a long time. We were not going to stay forever. So just like the question of what should we have done in November of 2001 after the Taliban was out, the same question then loomed, similar question loomed, when did we get out? 2005, 2010, 2015. Several administrations suggested this would happen. It never did. They would always both Obama and Trump said we would leave completely. Both changed their minds eventually. And so and why? Well, because they knew exactly what this was going to look like. It was going to look like what we saw in the last August. Was it going to look that bad as it did? And that's sort of shocking? Maybe not. But it wasn't going to be pretty, no matter how we decided to leave the country. Let me talk about a couple of other arguments that are, other countries that are arguments that people are making about the crisis in Afghanistan. One has to do with the criticism of the administration and of American foreign policy that this created problems with our allies. That is, that Germany was upset that we left. That essentially our allies looked at us and thought, why, if this is a fool's errand, why did you tell us to come in and get involved? I think that narrative is already over, frankly. Germany is incredibly upset, apparently. But the bottom line is what's Germany going to do? Withdraw from NATO? I doubt it. Openly criticize the U.S. Sure, they were doing that already. They're not going to strike out on their own. Can they continue to trust the United States? Maybe, maybe not. But frankly, given the geopolitics of Europe right now, they kind of have to. And should we count on that and take that for granted as the United States? Absolutely not. We need to help build the trust with Germany. But the idea that this is sort of fundamentally underlying relations with our NATO allies, who again helped us in Afghanistan with security assistance force there, I think it's going a bit too far. And I think people are sort of reacting to the very short term rhetoric that came out after the fall of Kabul in August. China. Many people have argued China took part at the withdrawal, and the fall of Afghanistan because they showed U.S. weakness. Maybe. But here's the interesting twist. ISIS-K, or ISK if you will, is now beginning over the last 2 weeks to greatly increase their anti-China rhetoric. Indeed, they claimed that the suicide bomber in that Shiite bombing that I mentioned earlier that killed 50 was a Uyghur, and that they have actually greatly increased their recruitment of Uyghur populations to work as suicide bombers in Afghanistan, to punish China, because China is the one country that has reached out extensively to the Taliban. And so now you have China starting to be concerned that they are going to be the next home for terrorist strikes by groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Because just as these groups would call U.S. foreign policy towards, for example, either the Palestinians or lack of action in Bosnia, sort of an affront to Islam, is ISIS and other Islamic groups are now beginning to put China in its targets for their treatment of the Uyghurs, detention camps, forced labor, etc. And so this will be interesting to see. Will this cause China to push away from its support of the Taliban? Will they continue to work in that country? Can ISIS carry out any threats? Unknown. Will be interesting to see. But I think that's been a super interesting twist. But the idea that China reads this as a moment of U.S. weakness, possibly, but again, I'm not sure exactly what that would look like or what policy needs to flow from that down the road. In fact, if nothing else, people will argue the opposite. That what this means is there's lots of resources that we can now train and that we can now use to confront China and some of their foreign policy efforts, for example, in the South China Sea. We will see that happens. Iran. What does this mean for Iran? There's no love lost between Afghanistan and Iran, either prior to this August or now. This does draw their attention, draws Iran's attention. Iran has played a very odd role in Afghanistan, in some cases helping some of the groups that have been fighting there, not necessarily the Taliban. In fact, interestingly, much of bin Laden's family, after 2001, fled to Iran, where they were held in prisons for a decade in that country. And in fact, what we now know, interestingly, from the cache of documents that we got from the Bottomland when bin Laden was killed by U.S. forces, was that many of bin Laden's followers and family in 2003, 2004, 2005 tried to convince bin Laden to start a holy war against Iran because of their treatment at the hands of the Iranian government in secret prisons there. So again, there's sort of odd politics, odd potential alliances and oppositions there. But given that again, I don't see Iran as the key player. The two key players in Afghanistan moving forward are Russia and, as always, Pakistan. Pakistan has long kept a quiet alliance with the Taliban, and again, not necessarily everyone in Pakistan, but certainly the security forces in Pakistan have extensive alliances with the Taliban. But now that they're in power, and for example, lots of refugees are flowing to Pakistan. The reports this week are those refugees are not being treated particularly well in Pakistan. And so now Pakistan finds itself sort of at a point of crisis also with refugees fleeing from Afghanistan. How they handle this, how they will deal with this with the Taliban, I think will be an interesting test for how the relationship between the Taliban and the Pakistani government is going to play out in the coming years. But finally, Russia. Russia knows Afghanistan. They know it very well. They fought a long and bloody war in Afghanistan. They have assets in Afghanistan. They have political interests in Afghanistan. And at this point, I would say, in my opinion, Russia feels like they hold some of the cards. The U.S. has left the theater. China is uncertain about the theater. Iran is uncertain about the theater. This leaves a vacuum. And it's a vacuum that Russia believes it will try to fill. Now, to what end, it's not clear to me. But given that it appears that Putin's overall foreign policy goal for the past decade has just been to reassert Russian authority wherever they can and wherever they're allowed, this plays right into that. I think this plays right into that narrative forward. So in the end, I think to end where I began, there's still a tremendous amount of political, economic instability in Afghanistan. I don't see that ending in the foreseeable future, unfortunately. And the great loser in all of this, as it has been for the last 35 years, are the people of Afghanistan, that are continue to suffer lack of rights, lack of economic development, lack of human rights, lack of political stability to live their everyday lives. So I'll stop there. I very much look forward to your questions, and thanks again for coming.
I did forget to mention this before, but now we'll open the floor up for the question and answer portion of the evening. If you have a question for the professor, please line up in front of the microphone, and he will address you.
So the increasing role that is played in Afghanistan, everything that's going on in China, if there were 9/11 style like attacks somewhere in China, what would China's response potentially look like? Would it commit troops? Would it not commit troops?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. I think, okay, so first of all, I would say, I think in general, the odds of an attack like that are lower than, say, here, just because security is much higher, right? I mean, it's a sort of, much more police state type setup than in the United States. And so the odds of those attacks, I think, are lower. If however, we look at to pull something off, first of all, I think it would probably be, I shouldn't say that. I mean, my guess would be, probabilistically speaking, it would be in, not sort of eastern coastal area of China. Let's say sort of out. I think it depends where. I guess that's what I'm trying to go to. Right? It depends on the style. It doesn't matter where it's at. I think if it were an attack in some of the populated areas, I think that would be one thing. I think if it were an attack in Shanghai or Beijing, I think you would potentially see a strong Chinese response. But I think that is the fascinating question. I mean, one can see. I think the short run, I think unless it is a horrific attack, like a 9/11 attack, I think the likely outcome would be China simply committing more resources to the Taliban, militarily, economically, and sort of saying, like, go get them. Right? But could one imagine an attack bad enough to where China would intervene directly? Possibly. But, yes, that would be difficult. It would also not be easy for them to do. Pakistan might be doing it. They would lean on Pakistan government indirectly as well. And most of Pakistan, they do have a shoulder with Afghanistan. But it would be logistically difficult for them to do. They could pull it off, but I think we have to be able to perfect. But it's a super fascinating question.
Professor Pevehouse, we're now with this event, there are two questions I have that the first one is, what will the future counterterrorism with US and NATO as look like in the Middle East region with regard to Taliban? And the second one is, what do you think the US should do now that a lot of people have been displaced? Thank you.
Great question. So, counterterrorism, I mean, I think one of the really open questions is how much, the Trump administration proceeded with the withdrawal plan based on the assumption that there would be some agreement between the United States and the Taliban for some transition, right? And that agreement, there is some form of agreement there. I'm not going to say the U.S. is counting a lot on that agreement. So then, and essentially what the agreement was sort of allowing the U.S. to kind of leave as peacefully as possible and create some type of future guarantee of no more like 9/11 style attacks, right? You're not going to house these terrorist groups anymore like you did Al-Qaeda. But I will just say, one of the things I think that's interesting about the ISIS-K phenomenon is the Taliban showing that that's a huge assumption, right? And that agreement that they can do that, right? Like, of course, with Al-Qaeda, they allowed them to be there, and they allowed bin Laden to be there. They're not lying ISIS hated either, but they can't see what they do. And so the hope of the US was that, well, if should some other group come in, that they would say, no, you can't be here, and you've got to leave, we're going to kick you out. But they're showing up, they don't have the ability to do that. So I think it's all more, it makes your question all the more important. Like, how does this think about counterterrorism? How do we think about security in an area, in a country where there's now, again, sort of rising chaos? Because let's face it, that's where groups, these organizations tend to prosper, right? There's lack of central authority, lack of rule of law. There's an Afghanistan in back there. They're not there yet, it's only there ways to go. So I think what counterterrorism looks like increasingly, and has been frankly for the last decade, has been increasing intelligence and information sharing with allies in the region, trying to get Pakistan to help, trying to at least get intel from Pakistan. But I think that's difficult. On the question of people fleeing Afghanistan, I think here I can't see the U.S. doing much. Obviously trying to resettle. I mean, there's two sides of this. There's sort of the initial wave, right? That some of which are resettled here in the States, some of which are resettled in other parts of the U.S. Now there's sort of a new wave that's happening that's going into Pakistan. This last wave that I think the U.S., as many countries, are just going to throw up their hands and hope that the International Organization of Migration and the UN can do something about this with Pakistan. I don't know, but I don't see. Given sort of the politics of immigration right now, it's hard to imagine the U.S. doing much more than that.
I have a couple of follow-up questions on that. First one, can you give an update on something that I found interesting that's disappeared largely from the news cycle, which is what is going on now with there were a small number of Americans who were essentially left, and then there were a number of Afghans who had worked with the U.S. when we were there. What's going on now? Because you don't hear much about, are they actively being pursued and prosecuted or killed? So that's one question. And then I think you maybe answered the second question, which was if you were advising the State Department and resettlement organizations about what is the nature of the resettlement of the Afghans who are at Fort McCoy and other places. It sounds like you're saying that is a long-term proposition that they're not going to be here just temporarily. They're likely here for quite a while.
I think, I'll take the second one, it's easier. I think, yes, it's a long-term proposition. And, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to imagine. Well, first of all, at this point, it's illegal to repatriate them right back, right? We're forceful repatriation at this point, at least under international migration law. And so I think that is a long-term thing. And I think the question is then, do you keep them together and allow it? I mean, I think there's just a lot of political questions involved in that, but I can't see them returning anytime soon. The other question, I don't have a good, I didn't check on that lately. You're right, it's largely disappeared. My sense is, I think my read on these things is often no news is good news. Right? You can see all kinds of news cycle incentives to report, one way or the other. And so I think the fact that it's dropped out of the news cycle probably is at least not bad news. In terms of that, but it's a good question. Yeah, because you're right. After about a week, I think the issue fell off. Yeah. So I don't think there is. So, initially on going in, right, Powell pushed for what he always did, right, overwhelming force, right, get the job, accomplish the job, and then, decide what to do. Rumsfeld, from the beginning, when he came into the DoD, even pre-9/11, was, lighter, leaner, right, there's no battle we can't win with, special forces, intelligence, technology, etc. It's sort of the era of great land wars that kind of come to an end. That's always been kind of been Rumsfeld's mentality. And so that all then plays out post 9/11. And so, and I guess the best way I can answer this is to kind of play out what happened in this similar debate over Iraq. Right? Like, when Iraq, after you go into Iraq, it's sort of the lighter, similar Afghan strategy in Afghanistan, the lighter, high-tech, the light Air Forces, air war. Then as that started, the ethnic conflict started to increase there, anti-troop activities started to increase there. The big debate became, okay, well, we're now in a counterinsurgency situation. What do you mean for counterinsurgency? Well, look at the Army's counterinsurgency manual, right? There are clear formulas about how many troops you need to do the successful counterinsurgency during an occupation. We're nowhere near that, right? In Afghanistan or Iraq. And so the counterfactual in Afghanistan is you go in with a really large force. You decide, okay, we want a nation build. That's another, by the way, interesting question. Like, did we have to do that? I think there the question was, yes, you had to do that because one of two things. One, many people, including Bush, there was a moral responsibility to do that. And two, there was a practical security responsibility, which is given Afghanistan's history. Just because you got rid of the Taliban didn't mean the next regime would also invite Al-Qaeda back or would want the Taliban back, right? And so it became like you need to try to build more fundamental institutions. Powell's argument from the beginning was that you need tens of thousands, you need hundreds of thousands of troops to do that. Now, play that counterfactual through. Whether that's successful or not, you then have stretched the U.S. military really thin, and Iraq becomes much more difficult to do. So, and I'm not saying they did Afghanistan that way because they also wanted to do Iraq at the same time. One can tell that story, but I think that it was more just about sort of the ideology of what's going versus Powell. But I think the counterfactual is a tremendously large U.S. force, which eventually we were at, with allies by 2007, 2008. But had that been as of November 2001, could we have gotten a quicker turnaround? We would have started reforming. We would have started running the Constitution right away. I think we could have tried. Whether it would have worked any better, given all these other factors I talked about, kind of doubt it. But I think the strategy that we did it helped. Thank you so much. Yeah.
We have two thoughts. What are your thoughts on what this means for India? And do you think it's harmful or maybe sort of a neutral watch for the U.S. trying to strengthen ties with Indians and geopolitical competition with the Chinese?
Yeah, great question. Again, kind of the initial gut reaction of folks was that it was somewhat harmful, that we showed we weren't committed to stability in the region, and we were kind of leaving a mess behind. I think now that there's been some time to reflect, given what, again, I see as a somewhat tenuous version of the Taliban, in power in Afghanistan, I think India's not anxious to kind of get involved there. I think India does watches Pakistan very closely and what they're doing. And I think the nightmare scenario I would think for India would be, that because of events in Afghanistan, one way or the other, you get an even more increasing radicalization of security forces in Pakistan, which then starts to push conflict onto India. So that's, I think, their nightmare scenario. Now, how the U.S. plays in that, what the U.S. keeps emphasizing to India right now is that, oh, look at Chinese Navy, they're starting to go to the Indian Ocean, right? And so, and India has responded to that, like they're responding to that, with sort of their own arms buildup. How much the U.S. can coordinate or cooperate with them with this, I don't know. But again, I think in the short run, it probably wasn't great for U.S.-Indian relations, but the long-run impact and implication, I think we'll have to see. And I think a lot of it's going to be on Pakistan.
Do you think it raises like the specter or chance of war between Pakistan and India for like reduced tension?
I think the mechanism by which that happens is probably now, right? The government of Pakistan, you can imagine something happening whereby the government of Pakistan either wants to kind of draw attention away from some massive failure, so they start, sort of pinning India, and Kashmir becomes hot again. Or that because, so in other words, sort of this like the dog distraction type strategy, or because of some perceived policy failure, immigration crisis in Pakistan, the sort of the ISI, which tends to be more radicalized than the rest of the military there, really starts to gain people power, and they somehow use that as a crisis. Then that has to be worried that they've got this more radicalized Pakistan regime on their doorstep, who then starts to escalate or attacking or something to try to get the kids. That really covers it. That
Right. And you think, okay, now.
your guess is
Right.
I was just wondering, so in terms of the collapse of foreign aid that's Afghanistan has seen, we've seen some moves by the UN to at least establish some kind of fund for Afghanistan. Do you see any of that improve in the future, or do you think it will just stay where it is? Some aid, not any other institutions?
I think, okay, yeah, good question. So yes, the UN has tried, and even the US has said that we would continue some humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. I think there's two issues. One is right, where you can build enough momentum, political momentum, to get more people to pledge aid. And I think part of that depends on how the Taliban is behaving. Like if they sort of go back to, and it appears that there have been some signs of this. And again, I think when we say the Taliban, you've got lots of different parts of the Taliban operating across the country. I think if you see sort of wholesale move back to complete undermining of women's rights, inability to protect or unwillingness to protect. In other words, if they, in the eyes of the international community, behave badly, you're just not going to get political welfare. If they do, the international community says, look, it's nonetheless, it's a humanitarian crisis. I think we have a second practical problem, which is delivery. The Taliban has been cutting off routes. Again, they're starting to do it with some of them. People, aid workers don't exactly often want to rush into places where, especially with ISIS-K, begins increasing attacks on aid workers, which is often a strategy adopted by within civil wars or conflicts that you see. So there's that practical, but they could. I think the Taliban is perceived as being, at least a somewhat reliable partner, if, especially if the humanitarian crisis is even worse. I could see some political building on that, for sure. But then you've got the logistical problem. Getting there now.
Follow up on Paul Rumsfeld dilemma, and is there anything that you think we've learned? And none of these situations are ever identical, right? So you can't just say, did we learn anything in Afghanistan that informs our thinking about Syria or anywhere else? But is there any reason to think that had we gone, had Paul won that argument rather than Rumsfeld, is there any reason to think that wouldn't have gotten to the same outcome with more American deaths and we left even quicker? Because is there any reason for thinking that doesn't turn into Vietnam or with the Soviets that, right? I mean, we can't, we'll never know, obviously. This is a rhetorical question, right? Is there any lesson that you think comes out of this that should inform our thinking for what we do in another situation? Again, it's not ever going to be identical, but what did we learn from any of this that we should think about going ahead?
Sure. Let me address two things there. That's great. One, on the very specific thing about this kind of factual where we have 500,000 troops right away in Afghanistan, something like that. Sure. I mean, it could have meant, let's say a quick transition to a regime, a stable regime, but then, like in eventually happens in Iraq and Afghanistan, you just got more targets, maybe more opportunity for lives lost. That said, I do think, and the reason I always kind of think about this is, man, post 9/11, like, you know, we were around that. Post 9/11, my hypothesis was that the U.S. public really tolerated significant practices. I don't know for how long. I don't know what circumstances. But post 9/11, you know, there were a lot of people who were willing to pay a high price if the answer was, this, we need to do this to make sure that, you know, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, you know, were responsible for this event are under control. Would that argument have sold? I don't know. Now, one thing that's really clear, I will say, from talking about this in class the other day, if you ask people, like, should we use military force to restrain the behavior of the country, almost across the board, no matter what country, what time period, Americans will say, yeah, let's do that. Vice versa, if you say, should we use our troops or our force to create a new reconciliation bill, even prior to 9/11, even back into the 70s, public that is very unsupportive of that. So part of it would be dependent post 9/11, could it have many people? How is that pitched? Is this pitched as we have to do this for security, or we have to do this to create a democracy? If it's creating a democracy, I think you're right. The first set of large-scale casualties that happen, you're going to have cloud today. Here's the other thing I think, or I hope, well, I see a lot of people talking about, is, again, Pakistan played such a crucial role here, right? We knew that they knew where a lot of these folks were, or suspected where they were. They would not help in many cases. And again, on its surface, it's just like crazy to think about. Like, okay, you have this state next door who is not only your ally, right? And you know that they know where the forces you are fighting are hiding out, and they're claiming the kingdom to them. They're claiming, you know, this is, oh, we have no authority out here. It's, you know, anarchy out here in the border regions. But there was very little, I mean, occasionally there would be still more help. But I think anytime you go into a country and you want to accomplish anything, and there's a place next door where the people who want to engage can go by. I mean, we thought we would have learned this from Vietnam, right? But, you know, yeah. So I think that's, yeah. That's something I think about a lot. Right? If I told you tomorrow we're going into, you know, there's been a horrible set of attacks and genocide, there's a horrible genocide happening in Bangladesh, and the perpetrators have fled and are hiding in India, and India's not helping us. Like, you know, you say, like, what the hell? Like, why not? And why aren't we really focused on India? You know, and we put pressure, but it just never came to anything. How let it go? And of course, right, during the Soviet time, we used Pakistan for that exact same purpose, right? Which was to run weapons and do that. And so the key, Pakistan is the key balancer in that region, especially vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And that's kind of what they want. I mean, that's not read on their preferences. They want Afghanistan to sort of be at their call and depending on that. And whether that meant helping the U.S. unseat the Soviets, or whether that meant the Taliban taking pot shots at the U.S. over there and accomplish their goal and accomplish their strategy. So,
do you have thoughts or opinions then on what an engagement policy with Pakistan or effective one might look like?
yeah, that's the question. I mean, we've tried to punish them and get leverage on them for other issues before. There was nuclearization, the military coup there, which, by the way, we were kind of in the middle of punishing them for when 9/11 happened. And it's like, look, we need them now, so I guess we're okay with, you know, with the military government there. Again, like, I think with Pakistan, we have to think about that there are significant bases of power in that country that are not, they're not at odds necessarily with each other, like in terms of open conflict, but they have very different preferences over, where there's a wealthy civilian side, and there's a military side, and there's the security, there's the intelligence side. And those three are often moving in different directions. And I think the U.S. often has had success, say, with one or two of those groups, but not the other. How you convince the rest of the country that the ISI is a problem that they need to get control of. That's the what leverage can the U.S. use to try to convince, again, this is what will be our interests, right? And, how do you convince them to get people on the other side and try to,
And my sort of limited understanding on that topic is that the ISI's interest in using that as sort of that concept of strategic depth vis-a-vis India. Going back, would you say it's the only thing I can think of that the U.S. would have leverage that would give them sort of an in to influence with the ISI was sort of convincing them or backing them up some way, which they're not going to do against the Indians, but convincing them somehow that they don't need to totally direct.
Right. No, I think that's right. And because if push came to shove, it's something for casual, the ISI would return to the Taliban. They would return to those groups, the whole thing. Send in whatever forces they could, So, it's hard to imagine, right? Whatever would be needed to really show them on that, not then redounding back poorly on the U.S. on the U.S. strategic interest. So, that's the chess game. Makes this all interesting.
One more question. Do you think, and this is totally agree, do you think the Biden administration is criticized too heavily in the war that started by the Bush administration, prolonged by the Obama administration, and then negotiated, and then ends negotiated by the Trump administration? Do you think Biden is just simply acting out, being just dealt a bad hand, or do you think there's actual criticism going on?
I think so both. Honestly, I think the reason Obama and Trump didn't fully get out is because everyone told them, well, this is what's going to happen. And it happened. Now, did it need to be, look, there were decisions made under Biden, in terms of the order of which it would Trump happen, some of the particular policies, like the logistic policies that were pushed, the timing of it, the accelerated schedule of some of it. That's what I hear. Even people who I view as sort of, let's say, center left, being very critical of Biden about, is that there were decisions made by the administration that were avoidable. And, meanwhile, on the center right, we hear other people saying, look, this was the right decision. It just did it poorly. Right? And of course, you have people on far both sides who can say whatever, but I don't really care about that. So I think the decision needs to be made, and I think people recognize that. And because of that, I think some criticism is inevitable and it's going to be unfair. Period. That said, there were logistical type decisions that I think are very good. It's a kind of
thoughts on what this means for the Tajis and the Uzbeks and Central Asian states, so the states, not so much the ethnic groups, what it means for them, or how much do you know about how they're thinking about this?
I don't have the states or
the states more so.
States, yeah. I don't have a good sense on that. I would guess they're, I don't have a good answer for that. My strong suspicion would be they're concerned about their ethnic minorities that are there, but again, can we protect them? Can they put, some of them have better or worse relations with the Taliban, certainly that was true previously, 96 on, 96 or 1. Again, what ones do they have? Do they adopt kind of a friendly strategy against the Taliban and ICE? Again, it hasn't worked. The Hazaras have not been treated well today. What eventually happens to Turkmens and Tajikis and Uzbeks. And I haven't had a good sense over the last few weeks of how this all been going.
For the U.S., I think it's extremely unlikely, considering that it'd be basically recruiting troops to the area right after we pulled out. Politically difficult, just the whole thing about sovereign states not wanting foreign troops coming in, and also the Russians not wanting U.S. troops going
think it's something like, I don't know if I can't speak to any sort of actual planning that's happened, but I will say it's hard to imagine.
I think I agree that it's really unlikely if you think there's any political or strategic benefit there. That's worth the risk or the downside for the cost.
I personally wouldn't think so. Is that what you're
Say
saying?
what?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, I guess the question would be what would be the strategic benefit, given that most of China's interests seem to be still focused in South China Sea, Eastern. Like their sphere of orbit, they want to expand into east and south, not west. I think the bigger place that we for to serve is that continue to be on the side for that. Although that said, after was the last summer, the fight between China and India, the over annexation like in the war for India, but I think that's the strategy is to try to lure India into some containment type of lines. That's just my take.
No, I agree. I'm pushing for, I'm just basically trying to stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, I think transformation is, well, I mean, it's about the West in terms of Belt Road, right? I mean, in terms of expanding development initiative, but that's more south. I mean, yeah, they're going to get some real different ones.
Is that really?
So you said that people in Afghanistan or people who were suffering the most from this. I was just wondering what actions, external actor like the U.S. or somebody else can take to remediate that?
Yeah, that's the tough question. I think, if there's a way to, someone earlier asked about sort of humanitarian assistance, whether it's the UN or some other set of organizations, I think that's in the short run. I think in the short run, it's trying to figure out a way to expand humanitarian assistance that actually gets to people, the folks who need it, in a broad-based way in the country, if the Taliban will allow that, the security situation will allow that. And maybe that's a mix of governments, and maybe that's a mix of private organizations too. I mean, private organizations have played a huge role in humanitarian relief and have for the last 2 decades. And that would frankly be if you like sort of private Islamic organizations, right, operating, whether it's like Red Crescent or those types of groups operating in areas the Taliban are much more likely to allow, to freely operate and distribute resources. But again, there are going to be people, some of those organizations are going to create discomfort on the U.S. side, I think. And in the long run, it's just about stability. And that's always comes back to this $1 million question, like, is it okay to promote stability? Stability can help development, stability can help human development. It's kind of, I think, a necessary requisite, but at what cost? And that's the debate we were having in 1999, 2000. Like, we had this Taliban regime that was not educating women and that was abusing ethnic groups and behaving sort of against the context of every major human rights, almost every major human rights law that existed. And so the question was, like, how do you improve the lives of the Taliban? There are people under the Taliban, and there were people calling for strategic strikes, intervention, etc. Well, okay, no one's going to call for that anymore. So then we're back to the question: how do we make the situation better in the long run? And I think stability. And so do you somehow root for the Taliban to be stable, even though it comes with all the externalities? That's the hard question.
How could that be conflicted by people like China or Russia with different interests?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, as we know, like China's support for other countries abroad, is not conditional on much of anything. And so, if the China's going to get more close to the Taliban, and Russia is going to continue to try to play an active role in the region, they are potentially a source for this type of aid, but of course they're not going to have any qualms about just giving it to the Taliban and letting the Taliban do whatever the Taliban wants to, right? And for whoever that gets that, and that's what you just have to say, like, what policies are the Taliban going to adopt? Are they going to, they promise to treat groups equally and to distribute aid and humanitarian equally. So far, I think in the last month, the evidence is fairly mixed on that. I think on the humanitarian side, they were doing okay on there, but they still haven't provided security in a equal fashion. At least from the things that I read. And so, right. So trying to complicate that in the sense of they're not going to hold the Taliban to any kind of set of standards that we normally used to, if say it were the EU or the US or the UN providing assistance.
Do you see the withdrawal having long-term effects on like Al-Qaeda, Salafi ideology in terms of a revolution of insurgency without each other? Talked about them seeking out foreign intervention to fight for traffic or with the intention of trying to where they're around. Do you see this as somewhat of a barrier?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, right, the narrative of the Salafi movements, well, Al-Qaeda in particular, and Bin Laden's sort of recruitment technique was really a lot about this grand narrative of, right, the Soviets came into Afghanistan, we beat the Soviets, and then the next thing you know, the Soviet Union disappears. Right, they're no more. We caused the decline of their power. And then we attacked the United States, and they came over and did all these things, right, and then we caused grief for them for 20 years. And so what doesn't fit with that narrative is, the U.S. left on their own accord, and then the government fell, but there's no grand decline, I think, of the U.S. But yeah, I mean, you can see, again, they will certainly play that into part of the narrative, the big narrative about the decline of the West and sort of luring folks into these types of battles on American territory. So yeah, at that level, yes, I agree. They're certainly going to try to do it and create that narrative. I think for me, there's some questions of how do you create a counter-narrative to that. And think about what the counterfactual is like. The counterfactual is, A, we don't know it at all. Right? Or, use nothing to like creep, right? There's no land invasion or whatever, we just sort of strike them from afar, which is what the Clinton administration tried, and they got Paddy in Sudan. Or we stay there for a long time until you're sure you wipe Al-Qaeda off the map, which is going to be hard to do. And so, but again, it's a hard talking point. It's not an easy talking point to launch on that. So short way, I think you're right. This could give them sort of more fuel to that narrative. And I think that's what counterterrorism experts think about this for decades trying to figure out. It's like, how do you counter that? Right? With the general public, and not the specialists or students, but with sort of the typical person who might be a target of that kind of.
Does anyone have any final questions for the professor?
So Afghanistan fell relatively very quickly. Was that an intelligence failure to anticipate how fast the country would fall, or was it just completely? Is it understandable that we did?
Good question. Depends on who you ask. So on one hand, I think one could paint it as an intelligence failure. That the speed at which it fell, I think, shocked some people in the intelligence community. But as I started the speech, I don't know that I mentioned this, when I said, the Taliban fell quickly, right? Like, the estimate was that it would take 2 to 4 months. Like, the estimate was that we wouldn't get the Taliban out of Kabul until mid-2002. It was like months. being involved in Afghanistan to get the Taliban and Al-Qaeda out of there. And it took weeks instead. Right? So sort of like we didn't kind of fully foresee that. I won't say the ease of that, but the speed at which that happened. So then people didn't see the speed of this coming either. Why do I say it's debatable? Read the SoPo reports, right? If you read the Inspector General for Afghanistan reports, they're like shocking, right? So the whole time, both the Afghani government and frankly the State Department and defense and everyone else is saying, okay, we have questions, but things are fine. The Inspector General's reports had these estimates of like, yeah, we estimate that a huge swath of the recruits who've been, or even active duty, who've been in the Afghanistan military for 5 years would abandon it overnight if they thought they were on the wrong side. Right? And that's exactly what happened. Right? You hit a tipping point really quickly, and it all turned, and everyone left. And that's what we saw in 2001 with the Taliban. And that's what we saw, with the new government in 2020. And so, was it an intelligence failure? Yeah, but there were voices, even within the U.S., that for a decade have been saying, like, we don't have what we think we have. Yeah, and we shouldn't be surprised if it goes south. But again, like, what are the political incentives to parrot that news to people? We spent how many hundreds of billions of dollars, upwards of $1 trillion, by say 2013, and we don't have a lot to show for it. And again, not that, and no one in those intelligence reports, right, those Inspector General reports aren't sort of saying, oh, the U.S. is doing a bad job. And it's not what they're saying. It's just saying, look, like, this is a very thin pool that you're swimming in, a very, very shallow pool that you're swimming in, and it's going to dry up quickly if you're not careful. And that's what we saw. That's what we saw happen. So yeah, I think it was a failure in the sense that it was shocking how fast it happened, but we've seen it before.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, Professor. We really appreciate it. We had that opportunity to listen to you. And again, on behalf of the Society of Politics Committee, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. That is the conclusion of the event.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.